The well should have been dry. That was the first wrong thing Eliza Crane noticed. Not the collapsed outbuilding. Not the barn boards gone silver with weather. Not the frost-hardened mud that swallowed the heel of her boot with every step. Those things she had expected. Those things everyone in Silver Creek had told her to expect in the particular tone people use when they want to discourage you, without taking responsibility for the discouraging. But the rope. She stopped 2 feet from the well's stone rim and stood very still in the February cold, the way her grandfather had taught her to stand when something didn't add up. Not rushing toward it, not backing away, just letting her eyes do their work without interference from what she already believed. The frame above the well was old. The crossbeam had a crack running through it that had been there long enough to weather gray, long enough to become part of the structure's character, rather than a warning about its integrity. The stones themselves were rough-cut granite laid with the patience of a man who was not in a hurry each course level, each interior face dressed smooth. The mortar between them had darkened with decades of frost and thaw until it was nearly the same color as the stone. All of that was old. The rope was not. She crouched and touched it with 2 fingers. Clean hemp tightly twisted, the fibers still showing their pale, natural color, barely weathered. This rope had not been here through last winter. It had been replaced carefully, deliberately within the last year, which meant someone had used this well within the last year, which meant against everything anyone had told her there was water here. Eliza Crane was 19 years old and had learned not to trust what people told her things were worth. She pressed her palm flat against the rope and leaned forward over the rim, letting her eyes adjust to the shaft's darkness. The smell that rose to meet her was not the flat mineral emptiness of a dry well. It was something like cool moving air carrying the scent of damp rock and deep earth and faintly something green. She straightened up slowly. Her grandfather had told her to look at the well first. He had told her to look carefully. Silas Crane had never once in his life told her to look at something carelessly, and he had never once said a thing he did not mean precisely. She looked carefully, and standing there in the February silence of Black Fur Valley, Montana, with the cold coming down off the eastern ridge in long level sweeps that found every gap in her coat, Eliza Crane began to understand that what she had inherited was not what anyone had told her. It was something else entirely. 3 weeks earlier, she had been standing at a hand-cranked laundry wringer at 6 in the morning, feeding wet linen through the rollers with the mechanical patience of someone who has learned to make her mind go somewhere else while her body does what it must. The laundry occupied the ground floor of a building on the east side of Silver Creek, Montana. The smell of lye soap had soaked so deeply into the walls that it came back at you in winter even when no washing was being done. A ghost smell, the smell of other people's dirt being made clean for wages that did not reflect the difficulty of the work. Mrs. Denton kept the books at a high desk near the front window and had opinions about everything that she offered without being asked. She was not a cruel woman. She was something perhaps more difficult, a practical one, who had long ago decided that sentiment was a luxury that other people could afford. Eliza had worked 6 days a week here for 2 years. She was not the youngest worker and not the oldest. She had learned early that drawing attention to yourself invited someone to remind you of your place, and so she had become very good at not drawing attention. She worked quickly and cleanly and did not complain about the weight of wet linen or the way the wringer handle wore a ridge into her right palm by mid-morning. She had strong hands. Her father had given her that along with very little else before the sawmill accident when she was 13 that the company settled for $4 and considered closed. Her mother had been gone 2 years before that. Fever. Quick and complete. After that, there was her grandfather's letters. Silas Crane living alone in Black Fur Valley, 40 miles east. Writing to her every few weeks in a cramped, careful hand. Never long, always warm, always ending the same way. Keep your eyes open, Eliza girl. The world hides more than it shows. When she was younger, she had smiled at that. Lately, it had begun to feel less like comfort and more like instruction. He died on the 4th of January, quietly in his sleep. A neighbor found him and sent word to Silver Creek. Eliza borrowed a black ribbon for her hair, said a private prayer in her cold rented room on the floor above the laundry, and went back to work the next morning because there was nothing else to do. She did not yet know he had left her anything. The room she rented was low-ceilinged, barely large enough for the narrow bed, and the washstand she shared with 2 other women on the same floor. There was a single nail for her coat, and a window that faced north, and let in more cold than light. She kept her savings in a cracked canning jar on the washstand, coins accumulated with the painful slowness of someone spending nothing that did not need to be spent, eating what was cheap, sleeping when she could, wearing her boots until the left heel needed a wedge of folded cardboard to keep level. The jar never seemed to fill, no matter how carefully she counted. She had no aunts nearby, no cousins she knew well, no sweetheart. No prospects, as Mrs. Denton occasionally remarked with the brisk efficiency of someone reciting inventory. What she had was work and the faint, persistent warmth of Silas Crane's letters. And when those letters stopped arriving, something shifted in the arithmetic of her daily life that she could not quite name or measure. The official letter came 3 weeks after the funeral, delivered by a boy from the county land office, who looked embarrassed to be handing it over. It was from the county clerk in Deaver, 1 town east of Silver Creek, and it informed Eliza in language so dry it seemed to repel emotion that one Silas Harmon Crane had recorded her name as sole heir to property in Black Fur Valley. 40 acres of barn, a stone well, and a collapsed outbuilding assessed at minimal value. Tucked inside the official envelope was a second, smaller one, sealed with a mark she recognized immediately. 2 circles joined like a figure 8 laid on its side. Silas had used that mark to seal every letter he had ever sent her. She opened it carefully. "Eliza girl," it began, "don't let anyone tell you what something is worth before you've looked at it yourself. Come to the farm. Look at the well first. Look carefully. Love, grandfather." She read it 4 times, sitting on the edge of her bed, with the canning jar of coins on the washstand beside her. Then she folded it very carefully and held it in both hands and looked at the wall. 40 acres in Black Fur Valley. She knew the valley, or knew of it. She had visited twice as a small child and remembered almost nothing except the smell of pine resin and the way the valley sat in a long shadow most of the afternoon. People in Silver Creek mentioned it occasionally, the way you mention a tooth that has been pulled briefly with a slight wince, and then not again. Abandoned, frosted over, half-fallen, worthless. She went to work the next morning and mentioned it once to Mrs. Denton, which was a mistake. "That valley land is good for nothing," Mrs. Denton said, not looking up from her ledger. Hard winter, bad soil, no neighbors worth mentioning. Your grandfather was a decent old man, but he was no farmer. You'd be a fool to go chasing after a ruin when you've got steady work right here." Eliza said nothing. She fed another sheet through the wringer. The letter sat in her coat pocket all day, and she touched it a dozen times without meaning to. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself she could not afford to lose a week's wages on a hope that turned out to be nothing. She told herself the farm was almost certainly a disappointment, a collection of falling boards and frozen mud, and a well that had probably gone dry before she was born. But her grandfather had never once told her to look at something carelessly. She was still reasoning with herself 4 days later when the second visitor arrived. It was a Thursday morning, the kind of February day that is gray from the first light, the mountains holding their snow under a low sky that promised nothing. Eliza was at the wringer when Mrs. Denton called her name from the front of the building, and she came through the steam and the lye smell to find a man standing near the door with his hat in his hands. He was not holding his hat out of courtesy. He was holding it because it was an expensive hat, and he did not want to set it on a laundry counter. That distinction told her something. He was perhaps 50, well built for his age, with the particular kind of weathered authority that comes not from outdoor work, but from spending many years telling outdoor workers what to do. His coat was good wool. His boots were good leather. His face was arranged in an expression of professional sympathy that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Crane," he said, "I'm Aldous Marsh. I represent Harlan Land and Timber out of Helena." He paused apparently to let the name settle. "I understand you've recently come into an inheritance. I'd like to speak with you about it if you have a moment." He had a card. She looked at it without touching it. "I have 40 minutes before my break is over," she said. Marsh smiled. It was a practice smile, the kind built for negotiations where one party has significantly more leverage than the other. "This won't take 40 minutes, he said. "I'll be direct with you, Miss Crane, because I think you're a practical young woman. That valley property is not worth what you might hope it is. The soil is poor, the growing season is short, and the nearest market is a full day's ride. We've done an assessment." "Have you?" Eliza said. "Harlan is prepared to offer you $200 for the deed. Cash. Today, if you'd like." He paused again. "You wouldn't need to make the trip out there at all. You could settle this afternoon and be back at work tomorrow." $200 was more than Eliza made in 4 months. She knew that, and he knew that she knew it. And the knowing of it sat between them in the lye-smelling air like a third presence in the room. She looked at Aldous Marsh for a long moment. She looked at the good wool coat and the good leather boots, and the practiced smile, and the card she had not touched. Then she said, "No thank you, Mr. Marsh." The smile stayed in place, but something behind it shifted slightly, the way light shifts when a cloud moves over it without eliminating it. "Miss Crane, I want to make sure you understand the offer. $200 is—" "I understand the offer," she said. I said no. A pause. The smile adjusted. "You'll want to look at it first." "Of course. That's reasonable." He retrieved the untouched card from the counter and tucked it into his breast pocket. "When you do, I think you'll find the situation is more complicated than an old man's letter might suggest. We'll be in touch." He put on his expensive hat and left. Eliza stood at the front of the laundry and watched him walk away down the gray street and disappear around the corner. And she thought a company like Harlan Land and Timber does not send a man in a good wool coat to offer $200 for worthless land. She went back to the ringer. She fed another sheet through. She thought about $200 offered the moment she received the inheritance before she had set foot on the land, before she had any opinion of her own about what it was worth. Her grandfather had told her not to let anyone tell her what something was worth before she looked at it herself. She put in her notice with Mrs. Denton that evening. It was a brief conversation. "You're a fool," Mrs. Denton said, not unkindly. "Possibly," Eliza said. She took her canning jar of coins off the washstand. The mail coach left Silver Creek before dawn on Friday morning. Eliza had her canvas bag over one shoulder and her grandfather's letter in her breast pocket, and the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision and stopped arguing with it. There were two other passengers, a cattle broker who slept immediately, and a woman wrapped in a wool blanket who watched the dark shapes of the mountains with an expression Eliza could not read. She watched the pines pass in the window and felt for the first time in longer than she could name. Not peaceful exactly, but pointed. She was aimed at something. Whatever waited in Black Fir Valley, she was going toward it with her eyes open the way Silas had taught her. The neighbor who had found her grandfather came to meet her at the edge of the property. He had introduced himself in a letter as Fergus Calhoun running a feed operation 2 miles east, and he matched the letter a man of perhaps 58 broad-shouldered, his face weathered in the particular way of men who work outdoors in cold climates and have made their peace with it. He stood at the fence line with his hat in his hands, but he held it differently than Aldous Marsh had held his. He held it the way people hold things when they don't know what else to do with their hands. "Miss Crane," he said, "I'm sorry about Silas. He was a private man, but he was deliberate. Everything he did on purpose." He looked toward the barn for a moment. "I lived 2 miles from him for 25 years, and I never understood half of what he built out here. I always figured someday someone would." He offered to come back in a few days if she needed help, and she thanked him, and he went. She stood alone at the edge of the property for a moment, letting herself take in the full picture. The outbuilding had collapsed entirely, one wall caved inward. The roof laid over it like a tired elbow. The barn still stood barely its boards, weathered to the particular silver gray that comes from years without paint. 2 upper planks sprung loose and hanging at angles that looked wrong against the straight lines of the rest of the structure. The yard was frost-hardened mud and dead grass, and the cold came down the valley in long level sweeps that found every gap in her coat. She let herself feel the disappointment fully, because she had learned from experience that swallowed disappointment came back up later harder. She stood in it for a moment, named it honestly, and then picked up her bag and walked forward. The barn first. The door was still on its hinges, which felt like a small mercy. Inside, dim light through the sprung planks, the smell of old hay and mouse, a rusted pitchfork against one wall, a few iron hooks, a milking stool with one leg cracked. But the floor was solid when she pressed her boot against it. The walls beneath their gray surface were tight and square. Someone had built this barn to last and then not been able to maintain it, which was different from someone building something that was never meant to hold. She moved through it slowly, running her hand along the walls, checking the boards. The damage in the far corner where the sprung planks had let water in over what was probably several seasons had created a soft spot in the floor below that would need attention before another winter. Not dangerous yet, but a countdown. The collapsed outbuilding held nothing she could use. She noted it and moved on. She walked the property perimeter in the cold, getting the measure of it. 40 acres was more land than it sounded like when you stood in the middle of it. The valley floor was better than she'd expected. The soil under the frost was dark, the color of earth that holds moisture well. Along the northern edge, a shallow creek ran half-iced but still moving, which was worth more than it looked. A creek meant she did not have to haul everything from the well. A creek meant water through the summer months. A skid trail cut into the eastern slope suggested Silas had already done timber work up there, and stacked rounds of split wood along the barn's eastern wall. Sat under a canvas that had weathered but held enough fuel for months. He had thought of everything, or nearly everything. She came back to the well. She had been putting it off, she realized. Not from fear exactly, but from something adjacent. The awareness that what she found here would determine everything that came after. And she was not quite ready yet to know what it was. She stood 2 feet from the stone rim and made herself stop. Made herself look without assumption the way Silas had taught her to look at animal tracks, or the tilt of moss on stones from the outside in slowly, without deciding what you were seeing before you had finished seeing it. The frame was old. The crossbeam was cracked and gray. The stones were patient granite laid by someone who understood weight and time. The rope was new. She crouched and touched it with 2 fingers, barely weathered. This rope had been replaced within the last year, which meant Silas had used this well within the last year, which meant the well was not dry. She leaned over the rim and let her eyes adjust. The shaft was dry stone for the first several feet, then dropped into darkness. The smell that rose from it was cool, moving, alive, damp rock and something green, and beneath that, the faint mineral edge of running water. Not a dry smell, not a dead smell. She straightened up and looked at the stones again this time, not at the rope, but at the mortar between the courses. Consistent, dark, and old, except for one section on the eastern side, at about knee height, where the mortar was noticeably lighter in color. Recent work, within the last few years at most. She crouched again and ran her finger along that seam, and there on the capstone of the second course, small and cut deliberately with a sharp tool, worn smooth enough to feel old, but still perfectly legible, a mark. 2 circles joined, like a figure 8 laid on its side. The same mark that had sealed every letter Silas Crane had ever written to her. Eliza sat back on her heels in the frozen mud and looked at that mark for a long time. Then she reached for the rope. It did not behave like a rope attached to a bucket. She felt this immediately. The weight at the other end was wrong, heavier than a bucket, and the movement was wrong too. Not the easy swing of a container on water, but a dull mechanical shifting. Something sliding against stone with deliberate resistance. She pulled slowly, hand over hand, paying attention to every signal the rope sent up through her palms. She heard wood moving against stone. She let the rope back down and leaned further over the rim, allowing her eyes full time to adjust to the shaft's darkness. On the eastern side of the shaft, where the newer mortar was, the wall was not a wall. She could see it now. A door low and fitted into the stone with iron hinges set flush with the surface so they would not catch the eye on a casual look. A latch on the inside. And the rope ran through a hole in the door's center, attached on the other side to what she could now understand was a counterweighted shelf, a goods lift she realized small and efficient, built directly into the shaft wall. When you lowered the rope, the shelf descended. When you drew it up, the shelf rose. Her grandfather had not built a well. He had built a way in. She found the access point after another 15 minutes of careful searching. A stone slab on the eastern side of the well frame, just inside a low ring of granite she had taken for a drainage lip. The slab was recessed, not mortared. When she worked her fingers under its edge and lifted it, rose smoothly on a counterweighted hinge of its own, exposing a passage wide enough to take a person sideways with stone steps cut directly into the earth, descending at a gentle angle into darkness below. Not cold darkness, warm darkness. She felt it on her face before she understood it. Air rising from below that was distinctly, unmistakably warmer than the February cold above. It carried that same smell she had noticed in the shaft. Damp rock, green water, living earth. The smell of something that had been kept and tended and had not been allowed to go dead. She took her lantern from her canvas bag. Her hands were steadier than she expected them to be. She struck a match, lit the wick, adjusted the flame, and looked down into the passage. 12 stone steps cut clean and even descending at an angle before turning a corner and disappearing from sight. Eliza looked up once at the gray February sky above the valley, at the dark shapes of the firs on the eastern ridge, at the 40 acres of frozen ground that everyone in Silver Creek had told her was worth less than the trouble of getting here. Then she looked back down into the warmth and the light. She went down. The staircase turned the corner and opened without warning into a space that stopped her at the threshold. It was a room, a large one, perhaps 20 feet across, with a ceiling that rose 8 feet at the center and curved down toward the edges in a way that made the space feel like the inside of something deliberate and protected. The walls were rough limestone, the natural material of the valley's deep ground. But the floor was planked wide pine boards, fitted close and level, slightly dusty, but not rotted solid underfoot when she stepped onto them. She stood in the entrance and let the lantern's circle of light move slowly around the space. Shelves along 3 walls, built in tiers, solid and square. Not rough work, but careful work, the work of someone who understood joinery. And on the shelves, rows of sealed crocks, their lids waxed tight, and their sides labeled in a hand she knew as well as her own. Stacked tins, folded cloth precise and compressed, bundled tools wrapped in oilcloth, everything organized, everything intentional, everything labeled with the year of its packing in Silas Crane's cramped, careful script. An iron hearth against the far wall, its pipe running up through the rock at an angle she would not have recognized from the surface. The hearth was cold now, but showed the blackening of long use. Above it, the rock was warm to the touch the pipe had been carrying. Heat up through the valley wall for years, she realized, venting through a chimney, disguised in the natural stone face of the ridge. She would never have found it from above. Behind the shelves at the far end of the room, a narrow channel cut in the plank floor carried clear water from a crack in the limestone wall. A spring. Natural, she thought, or nearly natural. The channel was cut too cleanly to be entirely accidental. But the water itself was real cold and clear, running with the quiet persistence of something that had been moving for a very long time and had every intention of continuing. The sound of it was small and constant and more calming than she could have explained. And in the corner, fitted against the limestone with the careful economy of someone building in a space that had to serve multiple purposes, was a small cabin. A room within the room. Its walls were milled timber, not rough-cut, proper lumber, planed smooth. Its door had an iron latch and hinges that moved without sound when she touched them. A quilted curtain hung across the single small window cut into its wall. Inside, through the open door, she could see the end of a narrow bed frame with a straw mattress and a folded quilt the color of deep winter sky. On the shelf above the bed, a tin cup, a candle stub, and a book, a farming almanac, well-worn, its pages marked at intervals with strips of folded paper. Eliza did not go into the cabin yet. She went to the nearest shelf, because on the nearest shelf, propped between a tin of lamp oil and a sealed crock labeled cornmeal, 1881, was an envelope. Her name on the front, Silas Crane's hand. She crossed the room in 3 steps and picked it up. She pressed it once against her chest before she opened it. Her hands were not entirely steady. "Welcome home, Eliza girl," it began. She read it standing up because she forgot to sit down. It was 2 pages written small and close without wasted words, which was, she thought, exactly how Silas Crane had written everything. He explained it all. The years of work, the reason for the secrecy, the spring discovered in the winter of 1858, when he had been digging a root cellar that went deeper than planned and broken through into a limestone chamber, with water running through it. He had understood immediately what it meant. He had understood it so clearly that he had covered the opening and told no one. He had built the refuge over the winters that followed, slowly, quietly, a few weeks of work each season, hauling materials down when the valley was empty and the light was bad and no one was passing on the road. He had built it with the patience of a man who understood that the most important things take the longest to do right. "I could not give you a start in the world. The easy way," the letter said. "I had nothing liquid to leave you. Nothing that would arrive in a neat package at a lawyer's office. What I had was time and skill and a piece of ground that people with sharper suits than me have been underestimating for 30 years. So I built you something underground and hoped you'd be brave enough to find it." Near the bottom of the 2nd page, in a section written smaller than the rest, as though he had almost decided not to include it. "Fergus Calhoun is a decent man. He knows the passage exists, but not its details. I asked him to look after the property and to help whoever came to claim it. He has agreed. Don't be too proud to ask him for what you need. I know you, Eliza girl. The pride has kept you standing. Let some of it go." She read the letter twice. Then she folded it and tucked it into her breast pocket alongside the first one. She looked around the room, the shelves, the hearth, the spring, the cabin, and she felt something happen in her chest that she did not have a clean word for. Not joy exactly. Not relief. Something older than either of those. Something that comes when a person has been standing for a long time in a doorway between what they had and what they needed, and someone finally opens the door all the way. Her grandfather had spent 26 years building this, not for himself, for her. She thought about Aldous Marsh and his good wool coat and his $200 offered before she could see what she was being asked to give away. She thought about Mrs. Denton and her ledger and her certainty. She thought about every person in Silver Creek who had looked at the name Black Fur Valley and made the expression people make when they mention a tooth that has been pulled. She thought about a company called Harlan Land and Timber, sending a representative to a laundry on a gray February morning to offer cash before the heir had set foot on the land. Above her, through 12 feet of stone and earth and packed cold valley floor, February was still doing its work. The wind was still coming off the eastern ridge. The barn boards were still going gray. The creek was still running under its ice along the northern edge of the 40 acres. But down here in the room Silas Crane had carved out of the living rock over 26 quiet winters, the air was warm and still, and the spring ran its small commentary along the channel in the floor, and the lantern threw its circle of amber light across shelves, stocked with the patient accumulation of a man who had loved her in the only way he knew how. Not with words, or not only with words, but with work. Real, lasting, careful work. Eliza Crane stood in the entrance of the underground room, one hand resting on the doorframe her grandfather had fitted with patient joinery 20 years before she arrived to appreciate it. And she understood for the first time that what she had inherited was not a ruined farm on worthless valley land. What she had inherited was a beginning. The well had never been dry. It had been waiting. She read the letter again in the morning, not because she had forgotten what it said. She remembered every word with the particular clarity that comes when something lands in you deeply enough to rearrange the furniture. She read it again because the first reading had been emotional, and the second needed to be practical. And Eliza Crane had learned young that emotion and practicality were both necessary, and that the trick was knowing which one the moment required. The morning required practicality. She had slept in the underground cabin on the straw mattress under the deep blue quilt, and the sleep had been the best she could remember in years. Not because the bed was comfortable, though it was more comfortable than the narrow one above the laundry in Silver Creek, but because the air down here was warm and still, and the spring ran its quiet sound through the dark, and there was nothing pressing against the outside of the walls. No wind finding gaps in the boards. No footsteps on the floor above. No Silver Creek February, doing its slow, mean work on the building around her. She had woken in the dark and lain still for a moment, orienting herself. And then the warmth had reminded her where she was, and she had felt something she did not immediately recognize because it was unfamiliar. It took her a moment to name it. She was not anxious. That was the thing. She had woken without the low-level arithmetic of worry that had been the first sound of every morning for as long as she could clearly remember. The counting of coins against the counting of days. The measuring of what she had against what she needed. The gap between those two numbers that never seemed to close, no matter how carefully she managed it. That arithmetic was not gone. The problems it represented were real and had not solved themselves overnight. But for the first time in a very long time, she had woken inside something solid, and the solidity changed the quality of the worry from drowning to merely difficult. Difficult she could work with. She lit the lantern and read the letter again this time. With a piece of paper beside her and a stub of pencil she found in the tin cup on the cabin shelf, making notes in the margins of her own thinking. The way Silas had made notes in the margins of the almanac. The letter's first page was personal. The second was practical, and she understood now that Silas had known the difference and structured accordingly the emotional truth first, so she could receive it, and then the information once she was steady enough to use it. He described the shelter's systems with the precision of an engineer, which he had never called himself, but clearly was. The hearth drew through the angled pipe to the chimney in the valley wall. She should check the flue cap each spring for debris before lighting the first fire of the season. The spring channel was self-draining through a cut in the boards at the far end of the room. She should never dam it, never alter its path, because the pressure behind the limestone wall was the spring's own business and not to be interfered with. The counterweight on the access slab above the well frame needed re-greasing each autumn with rendered fat, which she would find in a sealed tin on the second shelf. Third section from the left. She found the tin. She found the second shelf. She found the third section from the left. Everything was where he said it would be. She spent the first full day underground doing what her grandfather's letter called the initial inventory, and what she privately thought of as meeting someone properly for the first time. Because that was what it felt like, not cataloging a supply room, but being introduced carefully and in sequence to 26 years of deliberate thought made physical. The food stores occupied the entire first wall of shelving. Crocks of dried beans, lentils, oats, and cornmeal, each sealed with wax and labeled with the year of packing, and a brief note about rotation use. Oldest first, always. The oldest was from 1864. The newest from 1883. 20 years of annual addition, each layer representing one more winter of quiet preparation. She calculated the quantities roughly as she went and arrived at a number that meant months. Real months, not anxious weeks of adequate eating without spending $1. That number did something significant to the arithmetic in her chest. The second wall held tools and materials. A hand plane, 2 chisels of different widths, a wooden mallet, a small awl, a folding rule. A draw knife, still sharp enough to take hair off her arm when she tested it carefully. A coil of fine wire. A ball of tarred twine. 3 sizes of cut nails in separate tobacco tins, each tin labeled with the nail length in Silas's hand. A small leather roll of cobbling tools. A sharpening stone oiled and wrapped in cloth. Each item was in working condition. She knew this because there was a card tacked above the tools section that read simply, "Tools oiled last September. Oil again before first use. September 1883. 4 months before he died." He had known he was running out of time, and he had spent part of it oiling her tools. The third wall held what she thought of as the future. The leather satchel of seed packets she found on the lowest shelf, each one wrapped in oilcloth and labeled in the same cramped hand onion. Turnip squash, hardy rye winter. Wheat beet lettuce. Above the seed packets, a card, seeds viable 3 years. Plant rye first. Others after last frost. This valley runs 2 weeks later than the almanac says. Don't be impatient. She had read that note standing in the cold of the underground room and laughed alone. A short, sharp sound that surprised her, because it was so exactly like him. The instruction folded into the warning, folded into the knowledge that she would need to be told not to rush. She was impatient. She had always been impatient. He had always known it. The almanac in the cabin confirmed it. She took it from the shelf above the narrow bed and opened it to the first marked page, and there was his handwriting in the margin again, small and precise, as though he had been conducting a conversation with the book's author for years, and had simply been waiting for her to join it. She sat on the edge of the bed with the almanac open on her knees and read every margin note from the first marked page to the last, and it took her most of an hour. and when she finished, she felt more thoroughly known than she had felt since before her mother died. The practical reality arrived on the second day and did not apologize for itself. She went above ground in the late morning, pushing the counterweighted access slab open with one hand and stepping out into a cold that was sharper than the day before, the sky low and iron gray, with the particular pressure that means snow before nightfall. She walked the 40 acres again, this time with paper and pencil, making a proper list. What she had: the underground shelter fully stocked, the spring, the stone well and its hidden access system, a barn that was structurally sound except for one compromised corner where 2 seasons of water intrusion had softened the floorboards below the sprung planks, a creek along the northern boundary still running, a stand of usable timber on the eastern slope with a skid trail already cut, split wood stacked against the barn's eastern wall under a canvas enough to last the remainder of winter and well into spring. What she did not have: livestock of any kind, a working surface above ground that could be used year-round. The barn needed that corner repaired before it was reliable through another Montana winter. Seeds she had, but no broken ground. Income, and the specific problem of the sprung planks on the barn roof which she could not repair alone, because holding a board in position overhead while simultaneously driving a nail into it was not a thing a person could do by herself, without either a second pair of hands or a system of ropes and pulleys. She did not have the materials to build. She stood in the barn looking up at the gap where gray sky showed between the loose planks and thought about Silas's letter. Fergus Calhoun is a decent man. Don't be too proud to ask him. She thought about being too proud to ask. She had been too proud to ask since she was 11 years old. It was a habit that had kept her upright. It was also, she was increasingly aware, a habit that had kept her alone. She thought about Aldous Marsh and Harlan land and timber. She thought about the offer made before she could see what she was being asked to give away, and about the confidence behind that offer. The certainty that she would say yes, because $200 was more than she made in 4 months. And she was a 19-year-old girl with nothing. And why would she say no? She thought about why a company like Harlan would send a man in a good coat before she had even arrived. She went back underground. She found the locked drawer on the second afternoon, and it found her the way important things often do not when she was looking for it, but when she was doing something else entirely. Specifically kneeling on the plank floor to check the drainage cut at the end of the spring channel, making sure it was clear and moving properly. The drawer was beneath the lowest shelf on the seed wall, set into the base structure of the shelving unit itself, fitted so cleanly into the wood that it did not look like a drawer at all, unless the light caught the seam at the right angle. A small wooden pin served as a lock. Not a serious lock. Not a lock meant to stop a determined person, but a lock meant to say, this is separate. This is deliberate. This is something else. She worked the pin loose and pulled the drawer open. Inside, folded in quarters and wrapped in a square of oilcloth, tied with a length of the fine wire from the tool shelf, a map. She unfolded it carefully at the small table in the cabin and weighted its corners with the tin cup and the almanac and 2 crocks borrowed from the shelf. It was a map of Black Fir Valley, all of it. Not just the 40 acres, but the full valley. The ridge lines sketched in confident strokes. The creek marked with its proper winter and summer levels, the timber stands noted with estimated board feet. In figures she recognized as conservative because Silas was always conservative in his estimates. The 40 acres were bounded in heavier ink, their corners marked with notations she would need to cross-reference against the county survey. But the most significant thing on the map was not the land boundaries. It was the lines Silas had drawn in a different ink lighter running beneath the surface features like a second map overlaid on the first. He had labeled them in his smallest hand, cramped and precise water. Subsurface, confirmed by spring activity and soil saturation patterns. Winter 1861 through winter 1871. She looked at those lines for a long time. They ran beneath the entire 40 acres, not just beneath the well and the spring in the underground room, but across the full width of the property, branching in the way of underground water that has found the natural channels of limestone dissolution and followed them over centuries. The lines were heaviest under the lower acre, along the creek where the clay loam was darkest and the soil held moisture longest. Silas had spent 10 years mapping subsurface water on his own land. He had done it quietly and carefully, and had folded the map into a locked drawer beneath the seed shelf, and he had not told anyone what he found. Because what he found was worth a great deal of money, not farming money, not the modest value of good soil and reliable water for a kitchen garden and a small herd. The kind of money that came when a large operation needed reliable subsurface water rights in a valley where reliable water was scarce. The kind of money that a timber company with operations throughout the Mountain West would recognize immediately. The kind of money that explained why Aldous Marsh had been standing in a Silver Creek laundry with $200 in cash before Eliza Crane had set foot on the land she had inherited. She sat at the small table in the underground cabin and looked at the map and thought about Silas replacing the well rope after Harlan Land and timber had approached him in 1881. Not because the old rope was worn, because he was sending a signal forward in time to whoever would come after him. Look at the well first. Look carefully. He had known they would come. He had known they would come with money and with patience, and with the particular confidence of people who believe that the person on the other side of the negotiation does not understand what they are selling. He had spent 26 years building a refuge for her, and somewhere in those 26 years he had also understood that the refuge would not be enough on its own, that she would need to understand why the land was worth fighting for before she could fight for it properly. The map was not a treasure. It was a briefing. Eliza folded it carefully along its original creases and wrapped it back in the oilcloth and set it on the table where she could see it. Then she picked up her pencil and paper and began writing 2 letters. The first was to Mrs. Denton. It was very short. She thanked her for the employment, confirmed that her departure was permanent, and wished her well in 3 sentences that were polite and entirely final. She sealed it and set it aside. The second took longer. She wrote to Fergus Calhoun and explained her situation with the barn roof in plain terms. 2 sprung planks, 1 compromised corner, the specific problem of not being able to hold boards overhead and drive nails simultaneously. She explained what she could offer in return, her labor mornings for as long as was useful to him. She had strong hands, and she was not afraid of lifting. She would not be in his way, and she would not require instruction twice. She read it back once and almost crossed out the last sentence because it sounded proud, which she had just been told not to be. She left it in. Some truths were worth stating. She sealed both letters and felt something shift in her chest. A window opening or something like that. The feeling of air moving through a space that had been closed too long. She carried the letters to Calhoun's feed operation the next morning herself. Walking the 2 miles east in cold that had eased slightly overnight. The low sky from the day before, having delivered its snow in the small hours, a thin covering an inch at most. The kind that would be gone by afternoon. She found Fergus Calhoun stacking grain sacks in the covered loading area behind the store and handed him the letter without preamble. He read it standing up, which told her something about him. People who sit down to read letters are often looking for time to compose their response. People who read them standing up are usually deciding while they read. He folded it when he finished and looked at her in the direct, unhurried way she was beginning to recognize as his characteristic approach to most things. 3 weeks, he said. Maybe 2.5 if the weather holds. My eldest son is in Butte for the winter, and I'm managing this place and 2 rental properties without him. I can't get to your barn before then. I understand, she said, but I could use a hand with the loading dock 2 mornings a week until then. He named a figure small but real, a daily rate that was more than she had expected him to offer, and that she tried to refuse, and that he declined to take back, with the quiet firmness of a man who has made up his mind and sees no reason to unmake it. Silas would have wanted you to take it, he said, which ended the argument. She started the following Monday. The 2 weeks that followed had a rhythm she would remember later as one of the most clarifying periods of her life. Not because it was easy, but because it was purposeful in a way that the laundry work in Silver Creek had never been. Mornings at Calhoun's feed store, stacking sacks, taking inventory, sweeping the loading dock occasionally, helping load wagons for customers who came in from the surrounding valley farms, men who looked at her with mild surprise, and then when she lifted without hesitation, with the kind of respect that does not need to be stated. Afternoons back at Black Fur Valley, working through the refuge and the land above it, with the systematic attention that her grandfather's notes had made possible. She cleaned the hearth and tested the flue. Clear and sound the smoke drawing cleanly up through the angled pipe into the valley wall chimney she had finally located by following the pipe's trajectory from the underground room and looking for the flat stone cap on the ridge face that sat at a slightly different angle than the natural rock around it. She would never have found it without the letter's description, which was, she understood the point. She oiled every tool on the supply shelf in sequence the way the card instructed. She checked the seed packets and found all of them intact, the oilcloth wrapping still tight and dry. She repaired the interior cabin wall where one plank had worked slightly loose at the lower edge. A straightforward job with the mallet and a handful of cut nails from the tobacco tin marked 1.5 inches, taking perhaps 30 minutes. And she thought as she worked about the fact that Silas had built all of this to be maintained by exactly one person with ordinary tools and good sense. He had not built it to require a crew or a craftsman. He had built it to be manageable alone. That was not an accident. On the 6th afternoon, standing at the northern edge of the property where the creek ran shallow and clear under the thin remains of the morning's ice, she saw a man she did not recognize standing at the far boundary of the land, the western line where the valley road ran past. He was not on the road. He was on her land, perhaps 30 feet inside the fence line, and he had a notebook and a measuring tape and the particular focused attention of someone performing a task that he does not expect to be interrupted. She walked toward him without hurrying. He saw her when she was 20 feet away and straightened up with the smooth adjustment of a man who has been caught doing something he expected not to be caught doing. He was younger than Marsh, 30s perhaps, with a capable face and the cold eyes of someone whose job is technical and whose relationship to the land he measures is entirely professional. "This is private property," Eliza said. "Yes, ma'am." He capped his pen. "I'm conducting a routine survey on behalf of Harlan Land and Timber," she said. A pause. "Yes, ma'am. You're on my land without permission. I'd like you to leave." He left. He was polite about it, which she found more unsettling than if he had been hostile. Hostile meant uncertain. Polite meant confident. He was polite because he believed what he was doing would succeed eventually. And her objection was temporary. She stood at the western fence line for a while after he went and thought about the map in the locked drawer, and about 30 days, and about what it meant that Harlan was already measuring. That evening, she wrote a third letter to the county clerk in Deaver, requesting confirmation of the property boundary records and asking a specific question about the legal definition of continuous use and habitation under Montana territorial law. She did not know if she was asking the right questions, but she had learned from Silas that asking was the beginning of knowing and that not asking was the beginning of losing. Aldous Marsh came himself 3 days later. She was above ground when he arrived, working in the barn's damaged corner, assessing what she would need when Fergus came with materials. She heard the horse on the frozen road and came to the barn door and watched him ride in and dismount with the deliberate ease of a man who wants you to see that he is not hurrying. He had not brought the practiced smile this time. He had brought something quieter and more serious. "Miss Crane," he said, "I think we should talk plainly." "All right," she said. "Harlan Land and Timber has identified this property as containing significant subsurface water resources. We believe those resources have considerable commercial value in the context of our regional operations." He paused. "Your grandfather knew this. We discussed it with him in 1881. He declined to sell." "I know," she said. Something shifted in his face, a brief recalibration. "Then you understand why we're interested. And you understand that a young woman alone on 40 acres of hard ground with no income, and a barn that needs work." He let the sentence end without finishing it, which was a technique she recognized. The unfinished sentence leaves the listener to complete it themselves, which makes it feel like their own thought, rather than a threat. "You should finish your sentences, Mr. Marsh," she said. "I find the unfinished ones harder to respond to." A pause. Then something that might have been genuine respect moved briefly across his face before the professional neutrality returned. "You're in a difficult position," he said. "We can make it considerably less difficult. The offer is now $250. That's a significant sum." "My grandfather turned down your offer," she said. "Whatever it was, your grandfather was an old man who had spent 40 years alone in a valley and who had—" He stopped. "Finish it," she said. "Who had perhaps lost some perspective on the practical value of things." She looked at Aldous Marsh for a moment, at the good coat and the good boots, and the face that was doing the work of being reasonable while behind it, something else was calculating. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "my grandfather spent 40 years alone in this valley doing something with the practical value of things that I'm still in the process of fully understanding. I don't think he lost perspective. I think he had considerably more of it than the people who came to buy from him." She stepped back from the barn door. "I won't be selling. Not at 250, not at 500, not at any number you're prepared to say out loud." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, put his hat back on, and mounted his horse. "Montana has provisions for abandoned and unproductive land," he said from the saddle. 30 days of demonstrated use and habitation is the legal threshold. We'll be watching the calendar, Miss Crane." He rode out. She stood in the barn door and watched him go, and noted carefully that her hands were not shaking. She was angry, but it was a clean anger, the kind that sharpens rather than blurs. She went back inside and looked at the damaged corner. Then she went to Fergus Calhoun's feed store, and when he came out to the loading dock, she told him what had happened without embellishment or drama, the way you tell someone the truth when you need them to understand it clearly. Fergus listened with the same unhurried patience he brought to most things. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He came to Silas in '81, Fergus said. "I didn't know the reason until just now, but I remember the week after. Silas came in to buy new rope." He paused. "Not because he needed it, because he had something to do with it. The rope. The signal sent forward through time." "Can you come sooner?" she asked. "To the barn." "I can come Saturday," Fergus said. He came Saturday with Birdie, his daughter 12 years old, and slight, and possessed of a watchful quality that Eliza recognized and understood, the attentiveness of a person who has learned that listening carefully costs nothing and pays consistently. Birdie said very little in the first hour, working the loading area at her father's feed store with a competence that suggested she had been doing it since she was old enough to lift a sack end. She had her father's directness and something else of her own, a precision of eye that Eliza noticed when the girl assessed the barn corner without being asked to, and immediately went to the correct load-bearing point and placed her hand there. "This one," Birdie said. "Yes," Eliza said. "That's the one." Fergus had brought 2 sawhorses, a coil of rope boards from his own stock, and a cold patience that 5 hours of February work tested, but did not break. They worked the damaged corner first, pulling the soft boards and replacing them with sound ones, then addressed the sprung upper planks, which was the part that had not been possible alone, the part that required Birdie to hold one end precisely level, while Eliza held the other. And Fergus drove the nails with the even economical swings of someone who has been using a hammer long enough that it has become an extension of thought. By 2 in the afternoon, the barn corner was rebuilt and both upper planks were nailed tight, and the structure felt, if not new, like something that intended to stand through another decade of Montana winters. Eliza made tea on the small camp stove she had brought up from the underground room, using the sawhorses as a table, and they sat in the barn in the cold that the closed doors had now made merely chilly rather than punishing. And Fergus held his cup with both hands and looked at the new boards against the old gray ones and said nothing for a while. Then he said he was building for after Silas, everything I saw him do out here. He wasn't building for himself. No, Eliza said. He wasn't. Bertie looked around the barn with the frank, unsentimental curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to pretend not to be curious. Then she looked at Eliza with an expression that was direct, without being rude. "There's something under the yard," she said. Not quite a question. Eliza looked at the girl. She looked at Fergus. She thought about the letter Fergus Calhoun is a decent man. Don't be too proud to ask. She thought about the past 2 weeks of working alongside this man who had shown her nothing but steadiness and asked for nothing beyond fair labor in return. She thought about 30 days and a company watching the calendar. She thought about what it meant to trust someone. "Yes," she said. "There is." She set down her cup. "I'll show you." She led them to the well and showed them the rope and the mark in the stone. She showed them how the access slab lifted on its counterweighted hinge. She watched Fergus's face when he understood what he was looking at, the slight stillness that crosses a person's expression when something they have wondered about for a long time suddenly becomes clear. She led them down the 12 stone steps and around the corner and into the room. Bertie stopped at the threshold and looked at the shelves and the spring channel and the cabin and the hearth, and for once said nothing at all, which told Eliza more about what the girl felt than any words would have. Fergus stood in the entrance for a long time. He looked at the shelves. He looked at the joinery. He looked at the spring. He looked at the hearth pipe disappearing into the limestone. He moved slowly around the room, touching nothing, reading the labels on the crocks and the cards tacked above the shelving sections. He opened the almanac on the cabin shelf and saw the margin notes and closed it carefully and put it back. Then he stood in the center of the room and looked up at the curved limestone ceiling. "I used to see his light on out here at night," he said finally. "Winter nights mostly. I could see it from my upper window, just a faint glow. I always thought he couldn't sleep." He was quiet for a moment. "He never slept late. I realize now it's because he was always working." He looked at Eliza. 25 years I was his neighbor. I didn't know. "He wanted someone to know," she said. "He just wanted it to be me." Fergus nodded slowly, the nod of a man who understands something and is deciding what to do with the understanding. He looked at the sealed crocks on the first wall, the stacked tins, the folded cloth, the leather satchel of seeds on the lowest shelf. "Harlan knows about the water," he said. It was not a question. "They've known since at least '81, she said. "They have a man with a measuring tape. They have lawyers. They have 30 days. 23 days now," Bertie said quietly from the doorway. Eliza looked at the girl. Fergus looked at the girl. Bertie looked back at both of them with the calm of someone who has simply stated a fact. "She counts things," Fergus said with the particular mixture of pride and resignation that fathers carry about children who are smarter than is entirely convenient. Eliza looked around the room her grandfather had built in 26 winters of silence. The shelves, the spring, the cabin with its winter blue quilt, the hearth that had kept this space warm through every Montana cold since 1858. 23 days. She thought about the map in the locked drawer. She thought about the county clerk in Deaver, and the letter she had sent, and the question she had asked about continuous use and habitation. She thought about a man who had spent 40 years preparing for a fight he knew was coming, and had trusted her to show up and finish it. She thought about what Silas would have done next. Then she went to the cabin, opened the drawer beneath the lowest shelf, and took out the map. She spread it on the small table and stood back so Fergus could see it fully in the lantern light. She watched his face as he read the subsurface water lines and the notations and the 20 years of careful documentation in Silas Crane's smallest hand. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "He documented all of this himself," Fergus said. "Over 10 years," she said. "He confirmed it with the spring activity and the soil patterns. He knew what it was worth. He knew they knew." Fergus straightened up and was quiet for a moment with the quality of silence that means thinking rather than hesitation. "There's a judge in Deaver," he said at last. "Harmon Price. He's been on the district bench for 18 years. He does not care for Harlan land and timber." A pause. "They tried to acquire water rights on the Calhoun Creek tributary in 78. He ruled against them." He looked at the map again. "If Silas documented this the way I think he documented it." "He sent something to the courthouse," Eliza said, "before he died. A sealed envelope. I don't know what's in it." Fergus looked at her. Something in his expression settled the look of a man who has just understood the full shape of something. "I think," he said carefully, "that Silas Crane knew exactly what was in it." Outside, above 12 feet of limestone and packed valley earth, and one counterweighted stone slab, and 23 days of calendar February was doing its steady work on the land. The creek was running. The firs on the eastern ridge were holding their snow. The barn, its corner rebuilt and its roof boards nailed tight, was standing against the cold, with the quiet stubbornness of something built to last. Eliza folded the map back along its creases and wrapped it in its oilcloth. She set it on the table where she could reach it. She had 23 days. She had a map. She had a sealed envelope in a courthouse she had not yet opened. She had a neighbor who had lived 2 miles from her grandfather for 25 years and understood now what the old man had been doing in the dark. She was not alone. She had not been alone since the moment she came down the stairs. She just hadn't known it yet. The morning she drove to Deaver, the sky was the color of iron. Not the threatening iron of a storm gathering itself for something dramatic, but the flat, settled iron of a Montana winter that has made its peace with being gray and intends to stay that way for as long as it likes. The mountains to the east were invisible behind the cloud cover. The road was frozen hard, which was better than frozen, and then thawed and then frozen again, which was the condition that broke wagon wheels and the patience of drivers in equal measure. Fergus drove. He had insisted on this without making an argument of it, simply appearing at the well frame at 7 in the morning with his bay horse and the small wagon he used for feed deliveries, as though the arrangement had already been decided, which Eliza reflected. It had been decided by the kind of quiet, mutual understanding that does not require discussion because both parties already know what needs to happen. Bertie had wanted to come. Fergus had said no with the brief finality of a man who loves his daughter and has also made a practical calculation about courthouses and impressions. Bertie had accepted this with the compressed dignity of a 12-year-old who knows she is right, but has decided to defer. She had handed Eliza the folded map as they left, and said nothing which was more eloquent than most things people say out loud. The map was in Eliza's coat, folded in its oilcloth next to the 2 letters from Silas, and the response she had received from the county clerk in Deaver, a careful, formal letter confirming that under Montana territorial statute, continuous and documented use of land for residential and productive purposes constituted sufficient basis for habitation rights, and that any challenge to those rights would require the challenging party to demonstrate abandonment defined as a period of no less than 12 consecutive months of non-use, with no evidence of ongoing stewardship. She had read that letter 4 times. Each time the word stewardship had done something useful to the arithmetic in her chest. 26 years of tools oiled and seeds rotated, and flue pipes checked and rope replaced, and stonework maintained in the dark and the quiet. That was stewardship of a kind that no company with a measuring tape and a lawyer could produce paperwork to match. She held that thought for the 40-mile ride to Deaver and let it steady her. The Deaver courthouse was a 2-story building of red sandstone that looked as though it had decided to be permanent and had been making good on that decision for 30 years. It sat at the end of the main street with the undemonstrative authority of a building that does not need to announce its importance because everyone already knows it. A flag moved stiffly in the cold above the entrance. The steps had been swept recently. Aldous Marsh was already there. He was standing on the courthouse steps with a man Eliza did not recognize younger, carrying a leather document case with the particular posture of someone whose job is to hold papers and look prepared. A lawyer, she thought. Harlan's lawyer. Marsh himself was in a different coat than she had seen him in before, heavier and darker, which she registered as information about how seriously he was taking this morning. He saw her arrive. He gave nothing away, but he had not expected her to bring Fergus Calhoun, and the brief recalibration in his face when he recognized the older man was worth noting. Fergus climbed down from the wagon without hurrying and tied the horse with the ease of a man who has done it 10,000 times. He came around to Eliza's side and they walked up the courthouse steps together without speaking. Marsh nodded as they passed. Eliza nodded back. There was nothing else to say that was not better said inside. The proceeding was not a trial. It was a hearing, a distinction the clerk explained to her in the corridor beforehand, with the brisk efficiency of someone who has made this explanation many times and has trimmed it to its essential elements. A hearing meant one judge, both parties' relevant documentation, and a ruling that could be appealed, but that carried immediate force if it was not. Judge Harmon Price was a compact man of perhaps 65, with white hair cut close and a face that had the quality of good leather worn, but sound the kind that gets more useful with age rather than less. He came into the room without ceremony and sat without preamble, and looked at both parties with the level attention of a man who does not have time for performance and has not had time for it in a considerable number of years. Harlan's lawyer went first. His name was Delaney, and he was good. Eliza recognized his competence the way you recognize a skilled hand at any craft, by the economy of it, the absence of wasted motion. He laid out the company's position in clear, well-ordered language. The property at Black Fur Valley had been assessed as showing no evidence of active residential use or productive agricultural activity for a period exceeding the 12-month statutory threshold. The recorded heir one, Eliza Crane, had taken possession only within the current month. Prior to that, the property had stood unoccupied. He set 3 documents on the judge's desk. Survey reports. 2 of them dated within the past 6 weeks. One from before Silas died. Eliza looked at the one dated before Silas died and understood that Harlan had been preparing this for longer than she had known they were watching. Delaney concluded. He folded his hands. He sat. Judge Price looked at Eliza. She stood. She had prepared what she wanted to say with the same methodical care she had applied to the underground inventory, making notes by lantern light in the underground cabin the night before, reading them back, cutting what was unnecessary, keeping what was true. She was not a lawyer, and she did not try to sound like one. She spoke the way her grandfather had written, without wasted words, with precision, with the confidence of someone whose relationship to the facts is direct rather than constructed. She explained who Silas Crane was. She explained what he had built and over what period of time and with what documentary evidence. She explained that the property had been in continuous active use and stewardship for 26 years under his hand, and that the evidence of that use was physical material and thoroughly documented. She set the oilcloth map on the judge's desk. She set beside it the inventory list she had made during the first day of underground work, dates of packing on every crock and tin and seed packet in Silas's hands spanning from 1864 to 1883. She set beside that the farming almanac open to a page where a margin note in Silas's hand read, "Soil tested and turned North Acre Autumn 1882. Ready for rye in spring." Judge Price looked at the map first. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Delaney said from his seat, "Your Honor, these documents have not been submitted through proper evidentiary." "I can see what they are, Mr. Delaney," the judge said without looking up. Delaney stopped. Price set the map down and looked at the almanac. He read the margin note. He turned 2 more pages and read 2 more margin notes which Eliza had not directed him to, but which she had known were there because she had read them herself the first night in the cabin. One read water confirmed at depth, eastern boundary matches, spring behavior in lower chamber. The other read simply, "She'll need to know about the creek levels in May. Don't let her forget." The judge set the almanac down. "Miss Crane," he said, "you mentioned a sealed envelope submitted to this court by the deceased prior to his death. Are you asking the court to open that envelope?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said. The clerk brought it from the records room. It was a standard envelope sealed with wax, the wax marked with the double circle mark she knew as well as her own name. It had been received by the Deaver Courthouse on the 14th of November, 1883, 2 months before Silas died. The outside was labeled in his hand, "To be opened in the event of any legal dispute regarding property at Black Fur Valley, Deaver County, Montana. Silas H. Crane." Judge Price opened it himself with a letter knife, with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands that what he is about to read matters. He read it. He read it again. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when the people in them are aware that something is being decided. Price set the letter down on his desk and looked at it for a moment, with an expression Eliza could not read, because it was too composed the expression of a man holding several things steady at once. Then he began to read aloud. Silas's letter to the court was 3 pages. It was the most complete document she had ever heard attributed to him, methodical, precise, exhaustive. He had submitted a detailed description of the underground shelter and its construction history, year by year, from 1858 to 1883. He had included a sworn statement witnessed by a Deaver notary in October 1883, attesting to his continuous residence and use of the property for the duration of those 26 years. He had included the full geological documentation of the subsurface water system, with references to the hand-drawn map now sitting on the judge's desk. He had included a statement of his reasons for maintaining secrecy about the shelter's nature and location, not concealment for fraudulent purposes, but the reasonable privacy of a man who had built something on his own land in his own time. And at the end, in a paragraph that made the room feel very still, I am submitting this document because I know a challenge will come. It will come because the water under my land is valuable and because there are those who believe that a young woman alone with no immediate income and no legal representation will be easier to separate from a valuable inheritance than an old man who has made his intentions clear in person. I am making my intentions clear in writing in advance and leaving it to the court to ensure that what I built for my granddaughter reaches her intact. She is capable of the rest. I would not have built it for her if I did not believe that. Judge Price set the letter down. He looked at Delaney. He looked at Marsh. He looked at them with the patient level attention of a man who has been on the bench for 18 years and has seen this kind of transaction before and has formed a clear opinion about it. "Mr. Delaney," he said, "your survey reports are dated. This documentation predates them by years. The stewardship record is continuous and attested. The habitation was active and ongoing under the original owner through the date of his death and has been continued by the legal heir from the date of her arrival." He paused. "I'm not going to find abandonment here." Delaney said something about the right to appeal. "That right is always available to you," Price said. "But the ruling stands." He stamped the papers. He set them in the clerk's tray. He looked at Eliza once more with something that might have been approval or might have been simply the professional satisfaction of a judge who has read a good document. "Your grandfather was a careful man," he said. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. He was. Outside on the courthouse steps, the iron sky had not changed. The flag moved in the same cold wind. The mountains were still invisible. Marsh came out a few steps behind them. He stopped at the top of the steps and looked at Eliza with an expression that was entirely different from any she had seen on him before. Not the practiced smile, not the professional neutrality, not the quiet confidence of a man who believes the outcome is already decided. He looked for a moment like a man who has revised his understanding of a situation and is not entirely comfortable with the revision. "The company will consider its options," he said. "That's your right," Eliza said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he put on his hat and went down the steps and did not look back. Fergus stood beside her and watched Marsh and Delaney cross the street and get into a better wagon than the one she and Fergus had come in. He said nothing until they were gone. Then he said, "Silas sent that letter in November." "Yes." 2 months before he died?" "Yes." Fergus was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means a man is doing the arithmetic of something that matters. "He knew," Fergus said. "He knew," she said. They stood on the courthouse steps for another moment in the cold iron light, and then they went down to the wagon and started the 40-mile drive back to Black Fur Valley. She did not speak much on the drive home. Fergus did not require her to. He drove with the same unhurried competence he brought to every physical task, managing the horse over the frozen road with the minimal adjustments of someone who understands the animal well and does not waste effort on unnecessary correction. The mountains were still behind their clouds. The road was still hard. She thought about the letter Price had read aloud. She thought about October 1883. 2 months before Silas died, and what it meant that he had driven the 40 miles to Denver with a notary witness and submitted those 3 pages, and then driven home and continued oiling tools and rotating seed stores and checking flue pipes as though he had simply crossed one item off a long and patient list. She thought about the last paragraph. She is capable of the rest. I would not have built it for her if I did not believe that. She had not let herself feel that fully in the courtroom because the courtroom had required her to be clear and precise and steady. Now in the wagon on the gray road with Fergus quiet beside her, and the horse's breath making small white clouds in the cold air, she let herself feel it. He had known, not just about the legal challenge, about her. He had built 26 years of work on his knowledge of who she was and who she would become. And he had been right, and the rightness of it. The simple, complete, unambiguous rightness of being known that thoroughly by someone who loved you was something she did not have a word for. That was large enough. She looked out at the valley road and said nothing and let it be as large as it was. She went underground that evening alone. Fergus had offered to come in and she had thanked him and said not tonight. And he had understood without requiring explanation, which was one of the things she had come to value most about him in the 3 weeks of their acquaintance. He drove home with the quiet efficiency of a man who knows when his work is done and does not linger past it. Bertie had been waiting at the fence line when they came back, which she was not supposed to be, and had read the outcome from Eliza's face before anyone said a word, and had allowed herself one brief, fierce smile before composing herself back into the watchful stillness that was her natural expression. She had taken her father's arm and gone home without fanfare. Eliza let the access slab down behind her and descended the 12 stone steps in the dark, not lighting the lantern until she reached the bottom, and then only the small one. The one that threw a circle just wide enough to see by without filling the whole room. She went to the cabin and sat on the edge of the narrow bed under the winter blue quilt and looked at the spring channel running its quiet thread of water across the plank floor in the near dark. The sound of it was what she needed. Small and constant and entirely indifferent to legal proceedings and company lawyers and the names on documents. The spring had been running since before Silas found it, in 1858, and it would be running long after every piece of paper signed in the Denver courthouse had turned to dust. It ran because it was its nature to run, because water follows pressure and gravity and the patient logic of its own existence. And it had been doing so in this limestone chamber for a very long time, without anyone's permission or approval. She understood sitting there that she had not won today because she was clever, or because she had argued well, or even because Silas had prepared the documentation. She had won because the truth of what this land was and what had been done with it was simply larger and older and more thoroughly attested than the claim against it. You cannot argue a spring out of existence. You cannot survey away 26 years of careful work. You cannot produce a document that outweighs a man's life. She sat with that for a while, and then she reached for the almanac on the cabin shelf. She had read it through once during the first days of inventory. She had read the margin notes carefully, but there was one section she had saved without quite deciding to save it, the last marked page, the last folded strip of paper, tucked between the pages, like a placeholder for something important She opened to it now. The almanac's printed text on that page discussed late-season planting and soil preparation for winter rye. The mechanics of soil temperature and frost depth, and the importance of planting before the ground locked too hard for germination. Standard information. She had read it before without the margin note, and it had been useful in the way almanac information is useful. Practical, complete, impersonal. The margin note was in a different hand than all the others. It took her a moment to understand that. All the other notes were in Silas's cramped, careful script, written at different times over what appeared to be years' ink, varying in color and freshness. This one was the same ink throughout, written all at once, and the handwriting was different, slightly less cramped, slightly more deliberate, the hand of a man writing something he had thought about for a long time and was being careful to get exactly right. She held the lantern closer. The note occupied the entire margin of the page, running top to bottom, in a column as narrow as the available space, and continued across the bottom of the page in smaller letters where the column ran out of room. I have been writing notes in this book for 11 years, and I have been writing them to you. Though I did not tell you that because I did not know how to say it directly, I'm not a man who has been good at saying things directly to the people I love. This is a failing I recognize too late to correct in the time remaining to me. So I will say it here in the last note, the one I have been saving. I built this place because I could not build you a different life. The world did not cooperate with what I wanted for you. Your mother is gone, and your father is gone, and the world did not give you the beginning you deserved. I could not fix that. What I could do was work. So I worked. Every winter for 26 years I came down here and I worked, and I thought about you while I worked, and I built everything as though you were going to need it. Because you were going to need it. And I knew it. This is not a property. This is not an inheritance. This is an apology for every year I did not find a better way to close the distance between us. And it is a promise that the distance was never because I did not think about you. I thought about you every time I laid a board, and every time I sealed a crock, and every time I replaced a rope that did not need replacing yet, but would need it soon, and I wanted it to be right when you found it. You found it. That means you are who I believed you were. Plant the rye first. It is the most forgiving. Let the rest come after. Love, Grandfather. She finished reading. She held the almanac in both hands and looked at the last line for a long time. She did not try to stop what happened next. She had been holding it since the courtroom, and before the courtroom since the morning she read his first letter, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed in Silver Creek, with the canning jar of coins on the washstand beside her. And before that since the letter came from the county land office, telling her what minimal value meant in legal language. And before that since the boy from the land office came embarrassed to the laundry door. And before that since the night in her cold rented room when she said a private prayer and went back to work the next morning because there was nothing else to do. There was something else to do now. She cried. Alone in the underground room her grandfather had built for her over 26 quiet winters, with the spring running its small sound through the dark and the lantern throwing its circle of light. She let it come fully and did not apologize for it. She cried for Silas and for her mother and for her father and for the years of laundry work and cold rooms and coins that never filled the jar And for every morning she had woken to the arithmetic of not enough. She cried for the 2 visits she could barely remember, and the letters she had saved, and the note in the almanac she had not known about until tonight. She cried until she was done, which took a while, and then she sat quietly in the warm underground air with the almanac closed in her lap and the spring running beside her, and felt the particular clarity that comes after. Not happiness exactly, something more durable than happiness, something that had been building for 3 weeks underground, and that the letter had now completed the settled, quiet certainty of a person who knows where they are, and who they are, and what the work ahead of them is. She was in Black Fir Valley. She was Eliza Crane, granddaughter of Silas Crane, who had spent 26 winters building her a beginning and a promise, and a room full of tools and seeds, and the most thorough expression of love she had ever encountered. She had 40 acres of land above her with a mended barn and a running creek and dark soil waiting under the frost for spring. She had a company that would try again because companies like Harlan always try again, and she would need to be ready for that. And she would be. She had a neighbor 2 miles east who had been watching her grandfather's light for 25 years and understood now what the light was for. She had work to do. She set the almanac on the shelf above the bed and blew out the small lantern and lay down under the winter blue quilt in the warm dark, and the spring ran its quiet commentary beside her, and she slept. She was up before first light. She dressed in the dark. By feel, she had learned the cabin's dimensions in 3 weeks, well enough to move through them without light, and she took the lantern and the seed satchel from the shelf and climbed the 12 stone steps and pushed the access slab open with one hand and came out into the world. It was cold. It was the particular cold of very early morning in a Montana February that is beginning very faintly, and without commitment to consider the possibility that March might eventually exist. The sky was still dark, but thinning at the eastern edge, the darkness going from black to the deep blue that precedes gray, that precedes the pale, flat light of a winter morning. The firs on the eastern ridge were dark shapes against a slightly less dark sky. The creek made its sound along the northern boundary. She stood for a moment on the cold stone of the well surround and breathed. Then she took the seed satchel and walked to the section of yard nearest the barn, where the soil was most sheltered from the ridge wind, and the frost broke earliest in the day. She set the lantern down on a flat stone and opened the satchel and found the packet labeled Hardy Rye in Silas's hand. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against the earth, still frozen at the surface, but beneath the crust when she broke it with her knuckle and pressed into the soil below the earth gave slightly not thawed, not workable in the proper sense, but not locked solid either. The kind of ground that a determined person and a good intention can manage if they are not trying to plant a full acre, but only a first row. She worked along the edge of the yard with her hands breaking the frost crust in a narrow line and working the soil beneath it loose with her fingers, pulling out the dead grass roots and the flat stones, making something that was not quite a furrow, but was close enough to be a beginning. Her hands were cold and red before she had gone 10 feet, and she did not stop. She was not planting a crop. She understood that. February in this valley with its extra 2 weeks of winter that the almanac did not account for, and that Silas had accounted for in his margins, this was not planting season. A hardier woman than she was with better tools and more knowledge would have waited for March at the earliest and possibly April. But she was not planting a crop. She was planting a row. The first row, the one that said, "I am here. I am working this ground. I am not going away." She had 23 days to demonstrate use and habitation, or she had before the courthouse this morning. And though Price had ruled in her favor, Marsh had mentioned appeals, and appeals meant time, and time meant continued demonstration. She was not doing this for the law. She was doing it for the same reason her grandfather had oiled tools in September, knowing he would not live to use them. Because the work was the statement. Because the work was the thing itself. She planted the row by lantern light in the February cold, her hands working the soil, pressing the rye seeds in at the intervals the almanac specified Silas's margin note, adding in its precise small hand deeper than it says this soil. Extra inch. Trust me. She trusted him. She was 10 feet along the row when she heard the sound of a wagon on the road to the east. She looked up. Fergus Calhoun's bay horse came around the bend in the valley road, with the particular unhurried trot of a horse that knows its own pace and sees no reason to deviate from it. Fergus was on the bench. Bertie was beside him, which meant she had gotten up before dawn and made her case in the dark, and one which Eliza found entirely unsurprising. They pulled up at the fence line, and Fergus looked at her crouched in the dirt in the early dark and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're planting." "First row," she said. He climbed down from the wagon. Bertie climbed down beside him. They came through the fence gate and crossed the yard, and Bertie crouched beside her and looked at the shallow furrow and the seeds going in at their intervals, and the cold hands working the cold soil, and did not say anything either for a long moment. Then Bertie reached into the pocket of her coat and took out her own gloves and put them on. She moved 2 feet along from where Eliza was working and began to break the frost crust with her own hands, methodical and quiet, opening the next section of furrow without being asked. Fergus watched them both for a moment. Then he went to the wagon and came back with a short-handled spade, the kind used for precise digging rather than heavy work, and set to making the furrow properly where the two of them had broken the crust, working the soil to the right depth ahead of their hands, so they could follow and plant. They worked in the growing light without speaking, the three of them moving along the first row of rye. In the cold early morning of a February in Black Fur Valley, Montana, the lantern casting its amber circle on the dark soil, the creek running its sound from the northern boundary, the firs on the eastern ridge going from dark shapes to green as the light came up. Eliza planted. Fergus worked the furrow ahead of her. Bertie followed behind, pressing the soil back over the seeds with the flat of her palm, in the careful way of someone who understands that what she is covering matters. The row was 30 feet long when the light was full enough to see by without the lantern. Eliza sat back on her heels and looked at it. A single row of rye seeds pressed into partially frozen Montana earth in February, the soil dark against the gray frost of the surrounding ground, the line of it running straight and clean from where she had started to where they had stopped. It was not a farm. It was not a crop. It was not a solution to everything that Harlan land and timber represented, or to the question of water rights, or to the larger arithmetic of what it would take to make this land fully productive over the years ahead. It was a beginning, the only kind there was. She became aware after a moment that Fergus and Bertie were not moving. She looked up. They were standing at the end of the row, watching her, and Bertie had an expression on her face that Eliza had not seen there before. Not the watchful assessment, not the compressed precision of a girl who counts things and notices things and says less than she thinks. Something quieter than that. Something that, on a less restrained face, would have been called wonder. "She's starting," Bertie said softly, not quite to her father, not quite to herself. Fergus looked at the row for a moment. Then he looked at his daughter, and then back at Eliza kneeling in the soil with red hands and dark earth under her fingernails, and the empty seed packet folded in her fist. "No," he said. His voice was low and careful, the voice of a man choosing words deliberately. "She started a long time ago. We're just seeing this part of it now." Eliza heard them. She did not respond because they were right, and there was nothing to add to a thing that was right. She pressed the last seeds into the last inch of the first row and smoothed the soil over them with the flat of her hand. And then she stayed there for a moment with her palm flat against the cold earth of Black Fir Valley, feeling the ground beneath it, dense and mineral-rich and patient. The way good ground is always patient. The way her grandfather had been patient building in the dark and the quiet for 26 years. One winter at a time. One board fitted to the next one. Crock sealed and labeled and set in its proper place on the shelf. One row of rye. Then everything else. She stood up. She brushed the soil from her hands. She looked out at the 40 acres in the full morning light. The barn with its mended corner and its new boards bright against the old gray ones. The creek running along the northern boundary. The firs on the eastern ridge holding their green against the pale winter sky. The valley floor stretching out in its long, quiet expanse of dark soil, waiting under the frost for what came next. Below her feet, 12 steps down, and around a corner, the spring ran, its thread of water through the limestone channel, and the hearth waited cold but ready, and the shelves stood in their careful rows, and the winter blue quilt lay folded on the narrow bed, and the almanac sat on the shelf above it with its margins full of the most thorough conversation she had ever been part of, written across 11 years by a man who did not know how to say directly what he meant, and so had built it instead. She knew it now. She had read it in the dark, and she knew it, and she would keep knowing it. For the first time in her life, Eliza Crane was not standing in a doorway between what she had and what she needed. She was standing in the thing itself. She picked up the lantern and the empty satchel and walked toward the barn with the morning light at her back and the first row of rye behind her in the cold, dark soil. And everything, all of it, the whole 40 acres and everything beneath it, beginning.